Before we dive into today's story, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and support the channel. Your support means a lot and gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more incredible stories. All right, let's get into today's story. 3 weeks without a heartbeat of hope can make even miracles sound impossible. The intensive care unit had become strangely quiet whenever anyone walked past room 417. Doctors still completed their rounds. Nurses still adjusted medication schedules, and sophisticated monitors continued tracing steady lines across glowing screens. Yet almost everyone inside St. Gabriel Medical Center believed the outcome had already been decided. Ethan Brooks, the powerful alpha known throughout the city as a feared Mafia boss, had remained unresponsive for 21 days following a devastating accident. Every neurological examination reached the same heartbreaking conclusion. His body continued receiving advanced life support, but meaningful recovery appeared increasingly unlikely. Hospital administrators quietly prepared families and staff for the difficult conversations that often followed such cases, while Ethan's influential organization transformed the entire hospital into one of the most heavily protected buildings in the state. Well-dressed security personnel stood beside nearly every entrance. Visitors underwent strict identification checks, and whispered rumors spread through every department about the mysterious patient whose room never seemed empty despite his silence. Noah Bennett knew almost nothing about organized crime. At 24 years old, the gentle Omega had spent most of his adult life volunteering with patients facing long recoveries after losing his parents years earlier. He believed healing sometimes arrived through ordinary kindness rather than extraordinary medicine. His calm voice, patient smile, and willingness to sit beside lonely people for hours had earned him quiet respect throughout the hospital. When the volunteer coordinator asked whether he could help cover a difficult overnight shift because several staff members had unexpectedly called out, Noah accepted without hesitation. Only after receiving the assignment did he discover the room belonged to Ethan Brooks. Several nurses exchanged uncertain glances as they explained the situation. "He cannot respond," one of them said softly, "but we still speak to him as though he can hear us." Noah nodded politely. Everyone deserves that. As evening settled beyond the large hospital windows, the bustling corridors gradually emptied until only distant footsteps and quiet monitor tones filled the air. Noah entered room 417 carrying fresh flowers donated by a local charity, even though he knew Ethan would never see them. He carefully placed the arrangement beside the window before introducing himself anyway. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks. My name is Noah. I will be keeping you company tonight." The words disappeared into the peaceful silence surrounding the motionless alpha. Noah spent hours performing simple tasks that rarely appeared in medical textbooks but often mattered to families. He adjusted the blankets, replaced wilted flowers with fresh ones, read several chapters from a favorite classic novel left behind by Ethan's older sister, and quietly described the beautiful autumn sunset visible outside the window. He never expected an answer. He simply believed silence should never feel lonely. Close to 3 o'clock in the morning, exhaustion finally began catching up with him. It had been an unusually demanding week, and the comfortable chair beside Ethan's bed slowly became impossible to resist. Noah rested his folded arms carefully near the edge of the mattress, promising himself he would close his eyes for only a minute. Without realizing it, he gradually drifted asleep, his head gently settling against the blanket covering Ethan's chest. The room remained perfectly still. Outside, another nurse quietly completed routine rounds before continuing down the hallway. Inside, only the steady rhythm of medical equipment broke the silence. Then, without warning, one monitor emitted a brief, unfamiliar tone. A small change appeared across the screen. Seconds later, another followed. The previously unchanged pattern shifted almost imperceptibly before stabilizing again. The sound immediately caught the attention of the night nurse at the central station. She looked up, frowned in confusion, and hurried toward room 417 while calling for the attending physician. Neither Noah nor anyone else inside the room noticed the first extraordinary detail. Beneath the blanket, Ethan's fingers had moved ever so slightly for the first time in 3 weeks. The sharp alarm echoing through the intensive care unit shattered the peaceful silence of the early morning. Noah Bennett startled awake. lifting his head immediately from the edge of Ethan Brooks's bed as nurses and physicians hurried through the doorway. Confused and embarrassed, Noah instinctively stepped backward to make room for the medical team. One of the nurses quickly examined the monitors before looking at the attending neurologist with visible surprise. "His neurological responses are changing," she whispered. The physician carefully repeated several routine assessments that had produced identical results for 3 long weeks. This time something was different. Ethan's fingers responded ever so slightly when stimulated. His heartbeat remained stable, his breathing pattern showed subtle improvement, and the newest readings suggested activity that nobody had expected to see again. No one inside the room rushed to call it a miracle. Experienced doctors understood that recovery could never be predicted from a single moment. Even so, cautious optimism quietly replaced the resignation that had filled the hospital for days. Noah remained standing near the wall, unsure whether he should leave or stay. He felt as though he had accidentally stepped into someone else's story. A few minutes later, additional specialists arrived to repeat every examination. Each confirmed the same unexpected conclusion. Ethan had demonstrated measurable neurological improvement for the first time since his admission. News spread through the hospital astonishingly fast. Within an hour, members of Ethan's security team had increased their presence outside room 417, while senior physicians requested complete privacy until additional testing could verify the results. Noah quietly gathered his belongings, hoping to leave without attracting attention, but before reaching the hallway, he was politely stopped by Ethan's chief of security, a composed middle-aged alpha named Daniel Mercer. "Mr. Bennett," Daniel said respectfully, "our medical team would appreciate speaking with you before you leave." Noah looked genuinely puzzled. "Did I do something wrong?" Daniel shook his head. "Quite the opposite. We simply want to understand everything that happened during your shift." Inside a nearby consultation room, several doctors asked Noah to describe the evening from beginning to end. He answered honestly, explaining how he had read aloud from the novel, changed the flowers, spoken about the sunset, and eventually fallen asleep after becoming exhausted. He apologized repeatedly for dozing off while volunteering. Instead of criticizing him, Dr. Amelia Grant smiled reassuringly. "You cared for him with kindness. That is all we wanted to know." Noah still looked uncomfortable. "I did not cause those monitor changes, did I?" Dr. Grant folded her hands thoughtfully. "We cannot explain what happened yet. Medical science requires evidence, not assumptions. However, your timeline matches the first improvements we recorded." Noah quietly lowered his eyes, uncertain how to respond. Outside the consultation room, conversations among hospital staff grew increasingly hopeful. Ethan's older sister, Claire Brooks, arrived shortly after sunrise and listened carefully as physicians explained the overnight developments. Tears quietly filled her eyes for the first time in weeks, not because anyone promised recovery, but because someone had finally spoken the word progress instead of goodbye. Before leaving the hospital later that morning, Noah walked once more past room 417. Through the small window in the door, he saw Ethan resting exactly as before, surrounded by advanced medical equipment and soft morning light. Everything looked almost identical to the previous evening, yet somehow the entire room felt different. Hope had quietly returned. Noah offered one final gentle smile before turning away, believing his role in the story had already ended. He never noticed Ethan's eyelids tremble almost imperceptibly though somewhere beyond the silence, the sleeping alpha had recognized the familiar voice that had stayed beside him through the longest night of his life. 3 days passed before the atmosphere inside St. Gabriel Medical Center changed once again. Every neurological assessment confirmed slow but undeniable improvement. Ethan Brooks remained unable to speak, yet the specialists agreed that his brain was responding far beyond their original expectations. Doctors carefully reduced portions of his supportive treatment while monitoring every small reaction with cautious optimism. Outside room 417, security remained as strict as ever, but the conversations among physicians had shifted from discussing impossible outcomes to planning rehabilitation. Noah Bennett returned to his regular volunteer schedule, believing someone else would now care for Ethan. Instead, the volunteer coordinator gently stopped him before his shift began. "The Brooks family specifically requested you," she explained. Noah looked surprised. "Me?" She nodded. "The doctors cannot explain why, but every noticeable improvement has occurred when you were nearby. They are not calling it a medical cause. They simply think your familiar presence may provide emotional comfort. Noah hesitated for several seconds before quietly agreeing. When he entered room 417 again, everything looked remarkably familiar. Soft morning sunlight filled the room, fresh flowers rested beside the window, and the rhythmic sound of medical equipment blended peacefully with the quiet atmosphere. Ethan still appeared asleep, yet something about his face looked different. The tension that had once surrounded his expression seemed softer, almost peaceful. Noah smiled gently as he placed a new bouquet beside the previous arrangement. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," he said naturally. "I brought fresh flowers again. The nurses said your room has become the brightest one on this floor." He laughed quietly to himself before taking his usual chair. Throughout the afternoon, Noah continued reading from the same novel Ethan's sister had left weeks earlier. He occasionally paused to describe ordinary things outside the hospital window. Children playing in the nearby park, colorful autumn leaves drifting across the sidewalk, and an elderly couple walking hand in hand beneath the trees. Hours passed peacefully. Late in the afternoon, Ethan's older sister Claire Brooks quietly entered the room carrying homemade soup intended for the medical staff. She stopped almost immediately after noticing Noah reading aloud. "He always liked that book," she whispered. Noah smiled politely. "I thought perhaps hearing familiar stories might be comforting." Claire looked at her brother for a long moment before speaking again. "The doctors told me they have never seen neurological recovery begin quite like this." Noah lowered the book slightly. "I wish I understood why." Claire smiled warmly. "Maybe not everything meaningful can be measured immediately." Before Noah could answer, a soft sound interrupted the conversation. Both turned toward Ethan's bed. His fingers had curled ever so slightly around the edge of the blanket. Claire instinctively stepped closer while the bedside monitor continued displaying stable readings. She quietly pressed the nurse call button without taking her eyes off her brother. Moments later, doctors entered and carefully repeated another neurological examination. This time, Ethan responded not only with faint finger movement, but also with a slight movement of his eyelids. The room fell completely silent. Dr. Amelia Grant leaned closer before speaking calmly. "Ethan, if you can hear my voice, try opening your eyes." Several long seconds passed. Then, slowly and with visible effort, Ethan's eyelids lifted. Bright hospital lights blurred above him as his vision struggled to focus for the first time in weeks. Doctors, nurses, and family members surrounded the bed. Yet Ethan's tired gaze moved past every familiar face until it quietly stopped on Noah Bennett standing near the window, holding an open book against his chest. Confusion filled Ethan's expression because memories had not fully returned. But despite forgetting names, places, and recent events, something deep inside him recognized the gentle Omega immediately. Without speaking a single word, Ethan continued looking only at Noah. While everyone else in the room realized the first person the recovering Alpha truly seemed to see was the quiet volunteer who had believed silence never had to feel lonely. The days that followed brought steady progress no one at St. Gabriel Medical Center dared to predict only a week earlier. Ethan Brooks gradually regained enough strength to remain awake for longer periods, although many recent memories still appeared fragmented. His physicians explained that recovery after such a prolonged neurological crisis often happened in small, unpredictable steps. Ethan accepted every therapy session with remarkable patience. But there was one detail every member of the medical team quietly noticed. Whenever Noah Bennett entered the room, Ethan's attention immediately shifted toward him, as though the gentle Omega's presence somehow anchored the pieces of a mind still finding its way home. Noah never considered himself extraordinary. He simply continued reading books, replacing flowers, and speaking about ordinary life beyond the hospital walls. One afternoon, he described children flying colorful kites in the nearby park, while Ethan listened with quiet concentration, occasionally offering the faintest smile. Dr. Amelia Grant observed the interaction from the hallway before making a note in Ethan's chart. Emotional familiarity, she wrote, appeared to strengthen cognitive engagement during recovery. A few days later, Ethan was strong enough to spend time in the rehabilitation lounge overlooking the hospital garden. Claire Brooks pushed his wheelchair beside the large windows while Noah accompanied them carrying 2 novels and a small notebook filled with encouraging messages written by hospital volunteers. Sunlight filled the peaceful room as patients quietly completed therapy exercises nearby. Ethan looked toward Noah and finally managed to speak more than a few words at once. "Your voice feels familiar," he admitted slowly. Noah smiled with gentle encouragement. "I read to you almost every night." Ethan frowned thoughtfully. "I remember the feeling, not the memories." Before Noah could answer, Claire quietly handed him a thin folder she had discovered among Ethan's personal belongings after the accident. "I think you should see this," she said. Inside were documents describing charitable foundations Ethan had supported anonymously for years. Most focused on educational scholarships, children's hospitals, and community wellness programs. Noah turned another page and suddenly froze. Printed across the top was the name of a youth assistance center he recognized immediately. It was the very orphan support organization where he had grown up after losing his parents. The file included annual donations stretching back more than a decade, all approved through anonymous trusts connected to Ethan. Noah looked up in disbelief. "This cannot be right." Claire smiled softly. "My brother insisted that every contribution remain private. He believed gratitude should belong to the people receiving help, not the person giving it." Noah carefully studied several photographs attached to the reports. He recognized the renovated library, the counseling center, and the scholarship program that had allowed him to continue his education before becoming a hospital volunteer. His entire future had quietly been shaped by someone he had never met. Ethan watched Noah's expression with growing curiosity. "Do you know those places?" Noah nodded slowly, emotion filling his voice. "I live there. That center became my home." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the documents resting on his lap. Although many details remained beyond his reach, an unexpected feeling of warmth settled inside him. He could not remember signing those papers or approving those donations, yet seeing Noah hold the folder somehow felt deeply meaningful. Dr. Grant entered the lounge moments later carrying the newest rehabilitation schedule. She paused after noticing the open documents before smiling gently. "Sometimes recovery is not only about remembering the past," she said. "Sometimes it is discovering that the good we once placed into the world quietly finds its way back to us." Noah closed the folder carefully and looked at Ethan with entirely different eyes. The feared alpha he had first met inside room 417 no longer seemed defined by whispered stories about power or influence. Instead, Noah saw a man whose unseen kindness had reached countless lives long before fate unexpectedly brought them together beneath the quiet lights of a hospital room. Over the next several days, Ethan Brooks continued making remarkable progress. Physical therapy became part of every morning, followed by cognitive rehabilitation sessions designed to strengthen memory and concentration. Each achievement, no matter how small, became another quiet victory celebrated by the medical team. Yet among every scheduled appointment and carefully planned exercise, Ethan looked forward most to the hours when Noah Bennett entered the room carrying another book, another bouquet of fresh flowers, or simply another ordinary story about life outside the hospital. Those simple conversations somehow made every difficult day feel lighter. One peaceful afternoon, rain gently tapped against the large hospital windows while Noah organized several books on the shelf beside Ethan's bed. Ethan watched him in thoughtful silence before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" Noah smiled. "Of course." Ethan hesitated briefly. "Why did you keep coming back?" Noah looked surprised by the question. "Because someone needed company." Ethan slowly shook his head. "Many people visited. My family came every day. Doctors never stopped trying. But when I think about the darkness before I woke up, I only remember one thing clearly." Noah pulled a chair closer without interrupting. Ethan's voice remained quiet but sincere. "I remember hearing someone describe sunsets, books, changing seasons, and ordinary days. I never saw any of those things. I only heard your voice." Noah lowered his eyes for a moment, touched by the unexpected confession. "I never imagined you could hear me." Ethan offered a faint smile. "Neither did I. The memories are incomplete, almost like fragments of a dream, but every time you spoke, I felt less alone." Silence settled gently between them, not uncomfortable, but peaceful. After several moments, Noah admitted something he had never shared before. "When I was growing up at the youth center, I used to believe anonymous kindness came from people who never wanted recognition because helping others was simply part of who they were." He looked toward the folder resting on the nearby table. I never expected one of those people to be sitting in this room. Ethan followed Noah's gaze. I still cannot remember approving every donation. Noah smiled warmly. You may not remember every signature, but the people whose lives changed because of them certainly do. Ethan remained thoughtful before quietly asking another question. Did those scholarships help you? Noah nodded. Without them, I never could have completed my education or become a volunteer here. Ethan looked out the rain-covered window, absorbing the quiet weight of those words. Then perhaps life has a strange way of bringing people back together. Noah laughed softly. I think it does. Later that afternoon, Claire Brooks arrived carrying several personal items from Ethan's home, including family photographs and a leather notebook recovered from his study. Ethan carefully examined each picture, recognizing faces more easily than names. When he opened the notebook, a folded piece of paper slipped onto the blanket. It contained a handwritten list titled, Things Worth Protecting. The first entries mentioned family, loyal friends, and innocent people caught in difficult circumstances. Near the bottom of the page appeared a sentence written in bold letters. Never allow power to become more important than people. Ethan stared at the words for a long time before quietly closing the notebook. I wrote this. Claire nodded. Years ago. Ethan smiled faintly. Then perhaps I already knew the person I wanted to become long before I forgot who I was. Noah looked at him with growing admiration, realizing the strongest part of Ethan's character had survived even when many memories had not. As evening settled over the hospital, the rain finally stopped, allowing soft golden light to fill the room. Ethan turned toward Noah once more and spoke with complete certainty despite the many memories still waiting to return. Whatever happens after I leave this hospital, I hope the next chapter of my life includes the person whose voice helped me find my way back. Noah felt his heart grow unexpectedly warm, sensing that the remarkable connection growing between them was no longer defined by a mysterious recovery alone, but by two lives that had quietly begun healing each other in ways neither of them had ever imagined. 1 month after waking from the longest silence of his life, Ethan Brooks finally stood outside St. Gabriel Medical Center beneath a clear autumn sky. The hospital entrance that had once represented uncertainty now felt like the beginning of an entirely different future. Although his strength had not fully returned, every step came easier than the one before. Physical therapy continued 3 mornings each week. Regular neurological evaluations remained part of his schedule, and his doctors reminded him that recovery was still a journey rather than a destination. Ethan accepted every instruction without complaint because for the first time in years he no longer measured success by control or influence. He measured it by ordinary moments he had almost lost forever. Noah Bennett walked beside him carrying a small paper bag filled with books borrowed from the hospital library. They had developed a quiet tradition during Ethan's rehabilitation. Every Friday, they exchanged one finished novel for another, discussing favorite characters over coffee in the hospital garden before therapy sessions began. Ethan smiled as Noah handed him the newest selection. Another classic? Noah laughed softly. You always remember the stories better than I do. Ethan looked down at the worn cover before replying. Maybe stories are easier to remember because they remind us who we hope to become. Their peaceful conversation was interrupted by Daniel Mercer, Ethan's longtime security chief, who approached respectfully carrying several neatly organized folders. The board has been waiting for your decision, Daniel explained. Everyone assumes you will return to leading the organization exactly as before. Ethan accepted the folders but did not open them immediately. Instead, he looked toward Noah, who quietly stepped aside to give him privacy. After a long, thoughtful silence, Ethan finally spoke. For years I believed protecting people required building more power. Lying in that hospital bed taught me something completely different. Daniel listened without interrupting. Ethan continued calmly. Real protection begins long before anyone feels afraid. It begins by creating opportunities, supporting families, and giving people reasons to choose better paths. Daniel lowered his head with understanding. Then your decision is already made. Ethan nodded. The businesses operating legally will continue. The charitable foundations will expand. Everything else that no longer reflects the future I want will be placed under professional management until it can be responsibly restructured within the law. Daniel offered a respectful smile. I think many people hoped you would say exactly that. Later that afternoon, Ethan and Noah visited the Youth Assistance Center where Noah had spent much of his childhood. The building looked brighter than ever after recent renovations funded through Ethan's anonymous foundation. Children laughed in the courtyard while volunteers organized books inside the library that had once inspired Noah to dream beyond difficult circumstances. The center director welcomed Ethan warmly, though without grand speeches or unnecessary attention. She simply thanked him for believing that quiet generosity could change lives long before anyone noticed. Ethan looked around the cheerful building before turning toward Noah. I spent years wondering whether anonymous kindness truly mattered. Noah smiled. You were standing inside the answer. As the afternoon sunlight filled the library windows, several children gathered around Noah asking him to read one of their favorite stories aloud. He accepted immediately, settling into a comfortable chair while young listeners surrounded him with eager smiles. Ethan watched from across the room, quietly realizing that the same gentle voice guiding those children was the one that had once guided him back from overwhelming darkness. He no longer believed miracles happened because fate chose certain people over others. Sometimes miracles began with a simple act of compassion offered without expecting anything in return. Standing beside the library shelves, filled with possibility, Ethan understood that the life waiting ahead would no longer be defined by the reputation he once carried. It would be defined by every ordinary day he and Noah chose to spend bringing hope to others together. Several weeks after Ethan Brooks announced his decision to reshape the future of everything he had built, the atmosphere surrounding him changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Instead of spending long hours inside guarded meeting rooms, he devoted his mornings to rehabilitation, his afternoons to reviewing charitable initiatives, and his evenings to visiting the community organizations that had quietly benefited from anonymous support for years. Noah Bennett accompanied him whenever his volunteer schedule allowed, never because Ethan asked, but because their conversations had naturally become part of each other's daily lives. They rarely spoke about the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Instead, they discussed books, children at the youth center, medical research, and simple plans for weekends that once would have seemed impossible. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel Mercer requested a private meeting in Ethan's office. His expression remained respectful, but noticeably more serious than usual. Several senior partners would like you to reconsider your decision, Daniel explained calmly. They believe the organization should continue exactly as it always has. Ethan listened quietly before looking toward the large window overlooking the city. And what do you believe? Daniel answered without hesitation. I believe you have already chosen the future you want. Ethan smiled faintly. Then nothing has changed. Later that afternoon, several longtime associates arrived for a scheduled discussion. The meeting remained professional and surprisingly calm. Rather than arguing about influence or authority, they questioned whether stepping away from old traditions might weaken everything Ethan had spent years building. Ethan folded his hands together before answering. Strength is measured by what remains after fear disappears. If everything depends upon fear, then nothing lasting has truly been built. The room fell silent. No one interrupted him. For years, Ethan continued. I believed responsibility meant carrying every burden alone. Lying unconscious taught me something far more valuable. The people worth protecting deserve opportunities, stability, education, and hope far more than they need another powerful leader. Several of those present exchanged thoughtful glances. Although not everyone immediately agreed, no one challenged the sincerity behind his words. When the meeting ended, Daniel quietly walked beside Ethan into the hallway. I think today changed more minds than you realize. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Real change rarely happens all at once. Meanwhile, Noah spent the afternoon helping organize a reading event for children at the Youth Assistance Center. Laughter filled the renovated library as young readers eagerly chose stories from newly donated shelves. While arranging books, Noah noticed a familiar face standing quietly near the entrance. Claire Brooks had arrived carrying several large boxes filled with educational supplies purchased through Ethan's foundation. Together they unpacked notebooks, art materials, and science kits while watching the children excitedly explore every new item. Claire smiled warmly. My brother always believed kindness should continue growing after it leaves your hands. Noah looked around the cheerful room before answering softly. Now I understand why. As evening approached, Ethan arrived at the center after finishing another rehabilitation session. Several children immediately greeted him with handmade thank you cards decorated in bright colors. Ethan accepted each one with genuine gratitude before joining Noah near the library windows. Outside, golden leaves drifted gently across the courtyard while families gathered for the community reading program. Ethan watched the peaceful scene quietly before speaking. I used to think changing the world required enormous decisions. Noah smiled. And now? Ethan looked toward the children laughing together beneath the autumn trees. Now I think it begins with making tomorrow a little brighter for the person standing in front of you today. Noah nodded gently, realizing that Alpha, once known only for power, had become someone defined instead by compassion, humility, and hope. Standing together inside the warm library surrounded by stories waiting to be discovered, neither of them noticed how naturally their lives had begun moving in the same direction, not because fate demanded it, but because every quiet choice they made continued bringing them closer to the future they both wanted to build together. By the beginning of winter, the idea that had quietly grown between Ethan Brooks and Noah Bennett had become something larger than either of them expected. During one of their regular visits to St. Gabriel Medical Center, Dr. Amelia Grant introduced them to several families whose loved ones faced months of neurological rehabilitation without emotional support. Some patients had relatives living hundreds of miles away. Others had no visitors at all. As Noah listened to their stories, he remembered the lonely hospital rooms he had walked through every evening before meeting Ethan. Ethan looked across the rehabilitation wing with thoughtful eyes before turning toward Dr. Grant. How many patients receive long-term emotional support from volunteers? The doctor sighed gently. Not nearly enough. Medical treatment helps the body recover. Consistent human connection often helps people continue believing recovery is possible. Those words stayed with Ethan throughout the following week. He invited Noah, Claire Brooks, Daniel Mercer, and several hospital administrators to a meeting inside the conference room overlooking the city skyline. Instead of discussing business plans or financial reports, Ethan placed a simple handwritten proposal in front of everyone. He wanted to establish a permanent recovery and family support initiative connected to St. Gabriel Medical Center. The program would provide trained volunteers, reading sessions, family counseling resources, temporary financial assistance for long hospital stays, and community partnerships to ensure patients never faced rehabilitation alone. The room remained silent for several moments before Claire smiled proudly. This feels like the future you were searching for. Noah, quietly read through every page before looking up with genuine admiration. People will remember this long after they forget anything else. Planning began immediately. Hospital specialists, social workers, volunteer coordinators, and local educators worked together over the next several weeks to transform empty meeting rooms into welcoming recovery spaces filled with comfortable chairs, bookshelves, artwork created by children, and quiet reading corners. Noah personally organized the volunteer training program, encouraging every participant to remember that listening often mattered more than speaking. Ethan focused on securing sustainable funding and building partnerships with charitable organizations so the project could continue serving families for many years. During one afternoon of preparation, Ethan paused outside room 417 while workers carefully installed a small plaque beside the entrance. Noah joined him without saying anything at first. Together they looked through the familiar doorway where advanced medical equipment had once surrounded a motionless hospital bed. The room had since been redesigned for recovering patients beginning their rehabilitation journey. Soft natural light filled the space, replacing much of the intimidating medical atmosphere with warmth and comfort. Ethan smiled quietly. Everything changed because one person believed silence did not have to feel lonely. Noah shook his head gently. Everything changed because one person chose to keep fighting even when nobody could promise the outcome. Their eyes met with a quiet understanding that no longer required explanation. Later that evening, the first group of families entered the new recovery center. Volunteers welcomed them with warm smiles. Children selected books from colorful shelves, and patients beginning difficult rehabilitation programs found peaceful spaces where conversations could continue beyond medical appointments. Dr. Grant watched the scene unfold before turning toward Ethan and Noah. "Every hospital treats illness," she said softly. "Very few succeed in creating hope." Ethan looked around the bright center filled with quiet conversations, gentle laughter, and people encouraging one another through uncertain days. Months earlier, he had awakened without understanding why a single familiar voice felt impossible to forget. Now he finally understood that true healing had never belonged to one remarkable moment inside an intensive care room. It continued growing every time compassion inspired someone to help another person believe tomorrow could still become something beautiful. 1 year later, the first snowfall of the season settled gently across the gardens surrounding St. Gabriel Medical Center, covering familiar walkways in a quiet blanket of white. Patients, volunteers, doctors, and families gathered inside the recovery center that had once existed only as a handwritten idea on Ethan Brooks's desk. Laughter now echoed through bright reading rooms where fear had gradually been replaced by hope. Children explored shelves filled with colorful books. Volunteers shared stories with patients beginning long rehabilitation journeys, and families discovered peaceful spaces where they could simply remain together through difficult days. Noah Bennett walked slowly through the center, greeting everyone by name, just as he had done long before his own life changed forever. Watching him from across the room, Ethan smiled with quiet gratitude. Many memories from before the accident had fully returned, while others remained distant, but one truth had never faded. The voice that had reached him during his deepest silence continued guiding him toward the life he truly wanted. That afternoon, Dr. Amelia Grant invited Ethan and Noah to visit room 417 once more. The room had become part of the hospital's rehabilitation program, welcoming patients beginning their own recovery stories. Nothing remained from the intimidating atmosphere of months earlier except the large window overlooking the city. Warm sunlight filled the comfortable space. Books rested neatly upon nearby shelves, and fresh flowers stood beside the same window where Noah had once placed a simple bouquet without expecting anyone to notice. Ethan quietly walked to the center of the room before stopping beside the bed. "This room gave me a second chance," he said. Softly, Noah smiled gently. "It gave both of us one." Ethan turned toward him with calm certainty. "I spent years believing strength meant never depending on another person. Then everything I believed disappeared, and somehow the first thing I found again was your voice." Noah felt emotion rise inside him, but answered with the same quiet honesty that had always defined him. "I never tried to save you. I only wanted you to know you were not alone." Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed the folded page titled "Things Worth Protecting." Time had softened the edges of the paper, but the words remained clear. He unfolded it slowly before adding one final handwritten sentence beneath the original list. "The greatest gift in my life began with ordinary kindness." Noah looked at the page before meeting Ethan's eyes. Neither of them needed grand promises or dramatic speeches. Their journey had never been built upon extraordinary declarations. It had been built through countless quiet choices to remain present when life became uncertain. Later that evening, the Recovery Center hosted its annual community gathering. Former patients returned with their families to celebrate milestones that once seemed impossible. Some walked independently after months of therapy. Others shared stories of renewed hope inspired by volunteers who had simply stayed beside them through long nights. Dr. Grant thanked every member of the staff before inviting Ethan to speak. He looked around the room, filled with familiar faces, and smiled warmly. "People often ask me when my recovery truly began. They expect me to mention advanced medicine or a specific treatment. Those things mattered greatly, and I will always remain grateful for every doctor and nurse who helped me. But recovery truly began when someone reminded me that compassion still existed even while I could not answer." Never underestimate the quiet difference one act of kindness can make in another person's life. As applause gently filled the room, Ethan looked toward Noah, who stood beside the bookshelves exactly where he felt most at home. Snow continued falling peacefully outside the windows while families laughed. Together inside the warm center they had built side by side. The future no longer belonged to fear, loneliness, or the weight of forgotten memories. It belonged to every new beginning created through hope, trust, and the simple decision to reach for another person's hand when they needed it most.